So let's actually get to what is mixed methods research and what are some of the current definitions. And I'm providing with you here some extracts from the 2010 Cresswell paper that was provided to the National Institutes of Health to provide some guidelines for grant writers on how to actually write effective mixed methods grant proposals. So first, you see focusing on research questions that call for real-life contextual understandings, multi-level perspectives, and cultural influences. So really trying to go beyond describing something, maybe going beyond whether something happens, and trying to obtain better understanding for why or how something happens. And again, you can see I'm already starting to more or less flesh out what would be, for example, within the concept of mixed method study, the quantitative strand, which would be kind of this goal of description or identifying patterns of relationships, and then a qualitative strand, which maybe would provide the investigator with some greater insights as to why or how something is happening. So again, that would be one particular reason for or one particular component of the mixed methods research. And again, there have been attempts to try to create a coherent singular definition of mixed methods, but I like Cresswell's approach a lot here in that it's broken down into some key elements, key core components of mixed methods. And I like considering that more than just simply providing you with a singular sentence definition, which might not always capture the complexities of mixed methods itself. Second, mixed method studies employ rigorous quantitative research assessing magnitude and frequency of constructs, and rigorous qualitative research exploring the meaning and understanding of constructs. So it's kind of similar to what we just talked about and discussed here in the prior point. But one aspect here I think is really important to remember, particularly for those of us that are new to mixed methods research, is this idea of rigor in both components, the qualitative and the quantitative. Now, again, one of the interesting things about mixed methods research, at least in terms of how I've approached it and understood it up to this point, is certainly there are different schools of thought related to mixed methods methodology. One could argue that Cresswell and kind of the group of Cresswellian scholars have more or less laid out most compellingly the parameters of mixed methods standards, mixed methods research, but they're by no means the only methodologists that utilize mixed methods and have attempted to describe and define what it is as a methodology per se. And some people, or some tend to suggest that simply by doing mixed methods research, one kind of assumes that one component, qualitative or quantitative, won't be as strong as the other, but by doing and effectively integrating them, it creates overall a stronger result, a stronger quote-unquote product. I'm not sure if I buy that necessarily, and certainly when one attempts to disseminate mixed methods research, it'll often be reviewed by fellow colleagues who don't necessarily have expertise in mixed methods, and so then they will actually appraise the quality of that work based on their own comfort, which tends to be generally either quantitative or qualitative. So with that in mind, really adhering to high rigor in both components or multiple components of a mixed methods study are very critical. Third, and this I think is fairly self-explanatory, utilizing multiple methods. For example, intervention trials and combining those with in-depth interviews. So again, in order for a study to be mixed methods, it should ideally be utilizing multiple methods. And again, there is some disagreement in the field. I have come across some very well-known methodologists in this area who believe multiple methods don't necessarily mean it has to be qualitative and quantitative. I tend to, at least when we think of what we consider mixed method research to be, that in fact there should likely be qualitative and quantitative strands within a singular design. Intentionally integrating or combining these methods to draw on the strengths of each. And this is really, really critical. As someone who has reviewed many grant proposals as well as manuscripts, I've often found in a mixed method study or proposal, if a study that is proposed is to fall apart, to be charitable, it usually is because the investigator or investigative team failed to provide a compelling way to integrate the qualitative and quantitative data. And there are many ways to do that. But more often than not, what you'll see is essentially siloed research within the body of a singular proposal or study. We did surveys, we did focus groups, and then there's no attempt to really bridge the findings, to bridge the strengths of both of those approaches together in a coherent way. That really is the essence of mixed methods research, this point of integration, this point of interface. And if one doesn't have that or one can't explain it, then you could make the argument that this really isn't a true mixed methods study. And then finally, framing the investigation within philosophical and theoretical positions. So again, it's not good enough to simply say, I am doing mixed methods research because one qualitative and or quantitative is weaker without the other. I mean, I don't think that's a really compelling rationale to do mixed methods research. Instead, one should utilize and draw on existing theories, many of which are very amenable to understanding constructs or relationships between constructs, utilizing multiple methods, and then making the case within that given theoretical or philosophical framework. And again, depending on your discipline, there may be many theoretical frameworks that you rely upon to either derive hypotheses or to better understand certain phenomena of interest. And again, I think the case can and should be made when one is developing a mixed methods proposal or disseminating mixed methods research is to really frame the methods within the larger methodology / theory, perhaps even paradigm that one is aligning themselves with. So kind of expanding a little bit on the prior slide is some other core components to consider when thinking about mixed methods research and definitions of mixed methods. So number one, and again, this is from a very useful Cresswell and Plano-Clark text from 2011. I'm assuming there'll be an update coming out soon. But again, I really like how the authors really identify core elements of mixed methods here. First is collects and analyzes persuasively and rigorously both qualitative and quantitative data based on research questions. So we talked a little bit about this notion of having to conduct rigorous methods within both a qualitative and quantitative strand. But then also here, which I think is interesting, is basing it on research questions. Again, I keep coming back to this idea of that there certainly isn't 100% universal agreement on whether a research question should be driving the selection of methods. There are some out there that believe that actually one's paradigm, philosophy, etc., is what drives the selection of methods per se. But I tend to very much agree with Cresswell's positioning here, because when I'm advising graduate students, when I'm advising others who really are excited about mixed methods, really want to do mixed methods, oftentimes when you really start thinking about the question of interest, that really then can best dictate one's not only methodological but methods that should be selected. And many times when, say, advising someone at the pre-dissertation phase, they like mixed methods, they want to do it, they're very excited by it, but then when you really ask them to, well, pose your question. What is your question? What are you really trying to answer? In fact, mixed methods may not be appropriate, and that's okay. And I would actually strongly emphasize that's a good thing. The last thing you want to do is go down the path of conducting mixed methods research, which is complicated. It requires a great deal of resources and thought when it's not really answering your question or the questions you're posing. So again, I think that's a key point here in this first core element. Second, mixes, integrates, or links two forms of data concurrently by combining them or merging them or sequentially. So I think the 2 points I want to emphasize for you here are the concurrent or sequential terms here. Mixed methods can happen concurrently where one is collecting both, say, qualitative and quantitative data at the same time. One traditional example would be administering a survey with multiple measures in it and then perhaps having a series of open-ended questions, or maybe even better, collecting, conducting a survey and then also combining that with some other type of qualitative data collection approach. Or they can happen sequentially. So for example, one administers a survey and then utilizing those survey responses identifies, say, key, basically stratifies responses in some way and then purposefully samples participants within each of those strata, and then conducts, say, semi-structured interviews or maybe a follow-up series of focus groups or something like that. So that would be more of a sequential design. One happens first, followed by the other. Again, but thinking of the timing of the elements and how the timing occurs is another key core element of mixed methods research. Third, gives priority to one or both forms of data in terms of what the research emphasizes. So it's important, again, when thinking of the question, when thinking of how one is mapping out their particular mixed methods study, their mixed methods proposal, is to really consider, does one strand, one approach drive the other? A good example would be conducting a randomized control trial and then embedding certain qualitative elements within that trial. Say, for example, related to process evaluation, trying to determine whether, or trying to determine better how or why an intervention works or not. I would argue in that case, in all likelihood, probably the quantitative element is driving the qualitative element in that particular mixed methods design. Alternatively, one may be approaching a certain question utilizing a grounded theory approach or something similar to that, and then wants to provide some empirical description of a sample, a context, etc. In that particular case, you in all likelihood, the qualitative strand is driving the quantitative strand. But again, thinking about prioritization is important when conducting mixed methods. And there are many examples where, in fact, one can't prioritize one or the other because meaningfully they're both adding and contributing in a similar fashion. But just because one element is deprioritized doesn't mean that the rigor in that quote-unquote deprioritized strand is de-emphasized. I mean, that is not the case either. So those are important things to remember. Uses these procedures in a single study or in multiple phases of a program of study. So in some cases, particularly in really complex, for example, program evaluation types of studies, it's not so easy to basically create a singular mixed methods study per se. Oftentimes the mixed methods or the multiple methods being used occur in long-term sequences. And in those cases, understanding that while we're using multiple methods and we're certainly mixing methods across the course of a program of research, it's not happening within the context of a singular study but multiple studies, versus many of us who actually are proposing a singular study that is actually a mixed method study. So it's important in differentiating those two elements as well. We had already talked about framing procedures within philosophical worldviews and theoretical lenses, and then combining procedures into specific research designs that direct the plan for conducting the study. Again, being deliberate in utilizing question to drive perhaps methodology and then methods, but being very deliberate in doing so. Basically mapping out and planning how will the mixed methods study occur? What will be the sequence? What is the most optimal type of sequence to, again, best answer my question of interest? And admittedly, sometimes questions are derived from theory, sometimes they're driven by theory, or potentially vice versa as well. But then framing this within a larger theoretical philosophical framework, perhaps even a conceptual framework, is very important. Certainly within a mixed methods research designs. So to conclude part one of this module here, I provided some of the key references that were cited earlier in these slides. I highly recommend taking a look at these, particularly the two Cresswell publications, is that I think they provide a really good introduction to mixed methods in terms of what it is, really expounding upon many of these initial points that I'm bringing up, but then also providing a really strong framework for how to conduct mixed methods research to apply to your own questions of interest.